Welcome to the Organic Filaments Network, where we trace the tangled lines of power, resistance, and planetary life. I'm your host, Sher Ali Khan. If you're tuning in, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. It helps keep these conversations alive and circulating. And if you'd like to directly support this work, head to buymeacoffee.com/Organic Filaments Network. Every bit helps sustain these fugitive threads. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Paromita Patranobish, Assistant Professor of English at Mount Carmel College, Bangalore. Her research moves across speculative fiction, toxic ecologies, postcolonial critique, and the embodied afterlives of global capital. Together, we dive into bodies, how they're shaped, exploited, and imagined otherwise. From the interconnected sensoria of Netflix's Sense8 to the poisoned landscapes of Indra Sinha's Animals, People. This is a conversation about what it means to endure, resist, and reimagine life in the toxic ruins of the present. Welcome to the show, Paramita. How's your day going?
Thank you so much, Cher. Thank you for having me on the show and for that generous introduction. Well, it's been a long day. As you mentioned in our previous conversation just before the show, I am a precarious academic. So a part of that is also juggling many roles, wearing many hats. And so it's been an interesting day doing a lot of things alongside teaching. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I'm really excited about the conversation, and I thought we could start by tracing your intellectual journey. You're trained in literature, but your work moves fluidly across fields of phenomenology, Marxist critique, medical humanities. How did you come to be interested in these questions of embodiment, toxicity, and speculative media?
Right. So my interest in the body, in fact, it didn't start with academia. It came from lived experience of having survived an eating disorder when I was very young. So I decided so for my PhD, I was already introduced to the kind of academic space of cultural studies during my MA and MPhil. And so for my PhD, I decided to directly explore philosophies around embodiment. And so I was already reading modernist. It was actually a bit of a disappointment actually when I tell people that my PhD is on Virginia Woolf. So it was in British modernism and primarily the work of Virginia Woolf and post-impressionist art. But what drew me to Woolf was this peculiar configuration of the body through the use of tropes of disembodiment. So the concept of disembodiment or figures of disembodiment, figurations of disembodiment like the specter, phantom, abjection, even non-normative registers at which bodies operate, wounding, injury, illness, to as ways of rethinking the anthropocentric humanist ideal of embodiment. And that's also a gendered, raced model of embodiment, always. So that is what kind of drew me into continental philosophy. And I found Maurice Merleau-Ponty's work on embodiment as perception and embodiment as a mode of not just existing as an isolated subjectivity, but as a mode of interconnectedness and intertwining with one's ecological sphere as a useful tool to look to kind of re-examine these literary texts and to also rethink the formation of the literary body itself. So that's where my interest in the body started. And towards the end of the PhD, my last chapter, which was on the waves, I got interested in thinking about the non-human body. And also thinking of the body beyond the boundaries of the bounded human subject. So, and this is where I also started reading a bit of Deleuze and Guattari. So I did individuation, hexaity, multiplicity, and so on as ways of approaching and then sort of exploding this bounded concept or expanding the idea of body as something that is tied to only the human. So that's where it starts. And then the shift kind of took place for me mostly during COVID, where I got this chance to look at my own research in a systematic manner. And then I decided that I kind of wanted to move into areas that were more contemporary and also to think about the implications of these philosophies for our sort of lived experience, right? The contemporary world. And also my own context as a South Asian scholar. So that is where I got into studying waste, and I was already looking at kinds of subjectivities or embodiments occupying the outside of hegemonic spaces and idioms. But I found waste, and so initially it was I was looking. It was through a purely eco-critical lens where I was thinking of waste simply as a byproduct of the Capitalocene, or as a byproduct of post-industrial modernity. However, as I researched, I went forward with my thinking and scholarship, I sort of became interested in thinking of waste in different registers and so different dimensions of waste, where it's not just, it would be injustice to think of waste only as a kind of automatic fallout or byproduct of industrialization. Of course, there is a material reality to waste and there is a material agency to waste, which a lot of scholars are looking at. But I was more interested in thinking of the ecology of waste. So, waste as an infrastructure, or waste as enabling, facilitating, and also preserving, in many senses, livelihoods, subjectivities again, but also sociological conditions. So, cultures of waste. So, that is where my research moved into. And then I also found that, especially with Sinha's work, and which is why Sinha's book has this kind of appeal for me, because it also explores how waste could become not only a critical heuristic with which to explore capitalist extractivism, but also and also neocolonial apparatuses of dumping and sort of territorial control via waste, which Max Liberon talks about at length in her work, but also waste as a site for the generation of certain kinds of bodies. Precarious bodies, bodies around. So for me, Jasbir Kaur's idea of debility, that's why I found it very useful, because debilitated bodies, disabled bodies, but as having a kind of direct connection with waste and toxicity, as produced and but also sustained by waste. So that is where I mean, that's kind of where my interest in Sinha's work, because Sinha's work kind of ties these various threads together in the figure of the crypt subject, who was
Yeah.
also quasi human, or at least
Yeah.
perceives himself as quasi human. And also, but I also am a little wary of, and which is where speculative fiction holds this attraction for me, because I find that very generative for against it. So sort of we also
Yeah.
need to be wary of reducing these subjectivities to a kind of doomsday scenario and looking at them only through the narrative of victimhood. What for me, as someone who studies cultural narratives, it becomes a space for the generation of alternatives. These could be forms of resistance, these could be forms of euphoria, of pleasure, but also of care. So,
Yeah.
kind of sociality, social spaces that form around blasted landscapes, as Anna Singh calls it. So, these kind of ecologies of waste and toxicity. So that is where currently, that's where my research, and I'm finishing my monograph on literary and artistic representations or engagements with waste. I'm also parallelly interested in narratives of non-human beings or non-human articulations. I'm also looking, and this is again very nascent, I mean, I'm not an expert at all, but I'm also interested in what is coming up as critical plant studies, looking at plants as generative of new kinds of philosophies, new ways of thinking about ideas of agency, identity, consciousness, sentience, and so on. So that's a small area of research. I'm trying to sort of move into that now and finding ways of putting
yeah.
toxicity and plants in conversation.
Yeah, no, that's a beautiful introduction to your work. You mentioned it earlier. Speculative fiction seems to be crucial to your critical method. What draws you to this form, and does this allow you to engage with unseen violences? I think you just mentioned that a bit, but could you expand on that point, sort of toxicity in ways that other maybe genres or methods might not, coming from your background?
So what? So this is again something that is very basic to theories of speculative fiction, that the alternative worlds or the secondary worlds that we see in these narratives are both catachristic kind of exaggerations of the world that exists, but also provide new conceptual sort of departures. So they kind of allow us to conceptualize what we see and perceive around us in new ways. So it's always the lure of what can be, right? And this realization that what can be is in many ways what is. It is just that the what is often harbors the danger of repression and invisibilization. The what can be is explosive and it's eruptive. So that is one. The other is the kind of, so for me, as somebody who's interested in bodies, the speculative world offers new ways of approaching the body beyond the human, beyond the anthropocentric. So the cyborg or the hybrid or I mean, and in a way that again alerts us to the dangers of something like technological utopianism. So that is the other. Specifically in the case of waste and toxicity, it is again, it's sort of the speculative mode becomes a space for. There are two ways in which we could approach waste as something that is inevitable. So we kind of make our peace with it, we accept it. And the other is this tendency to invisibilize waste or to disavow waste. And Alexis Shortwell talks about it in her book Against Purity. So that's the other problem, that we want to eliminate waste. Now, especially in the South Asian context or even in the global South, that comes with certain dangers of occlusion or erasure. Because if you want to invisibilize waste, you would also have to erase certain histories, certain social and economic concerns that are tied with waste. So speculative fiction gives that kind of not only legitimacy, but also visibility to something that as a society we tend to, that's the kind of natural tendency to marginalize it or invisibilize it, which is why in the essay, in my article on Indra Sinha on Animals People, I am kind of arguing against Nixon's idea of invisible slow violence, right, as forms of invisible violence. Because one of the things that one of the probably, I mean, the potentials of waste is that it is very in your face, even if you think of its sensory dimensions as an olfactory phenomenon. It is, you can't invisibilize it so easily. And that's something that I feel happens in the speculative space, where waste acquires a kind of agency. And there is almost yes, there is a sense of there's almost an impossibility of curbing that, or so it acquires that kind of that force where it becomes difficult to categorize it or to kind of curb it within existing epistemological systems. So yes, that so speculative fiction does highlight the question of violence, including forms of invisible violence or slow violence. But for me, the interest is the kind of counter narrative, the counter agency that waste and toxicity acquires in, or even bodies associated with waste and toxicity acquire in these narratives, where it is not about invisibility, it is about the excremental, it is about that which places itself right, in our line of sight and makes its presence felt. And then what does it do to our ideologies of presence or mattering? What matters? What do we what do we want to see and what do we want to invisibilize? So that's where the speculative, I find it as a useful genre, but also as a space of criticality.
Yeah, in that article, Discard Ecologies in the Hyposubject 2024, reading of like Indra Sinha's Animals People is quite interesting in the sense that you also introduced the concept, as you're just mentioning, of excremental toxicity, waste that refuses erasure. And how does this concept like sort of function to challenge dominant narratives of environmental recovery and cleanup in a broader sense? And what were you trying to sort of do with that for our audience?
So now I am in Bangalore. So one of the things that I'm also trying to do in my work is relate the speculative to the live. And I'm also working with organizations that are sort of trying to rehabilitate waste workers or are working in close proximity with waste workers and addressing issues that are very pertinent to their everyday lives, including dignity of waste picking as a form of labor, questions of whether waste work should be formalized, what are the dangers of such formalization, social attitudes towards waste work, which are still quite questionable. The kind of, again, the dangers of bodily injury and harm, questions of infrastructure, etc. Uh, so so that being the kind of parallel ethnographic work that I'm interested in, I kind of see, so there are two ways in which I'm approaching the toxic in Indra Simha's work. One is as chemical toxicants. So because this is a kind of a retelling of the Bhopal gas explosion, and it's a kind of, it's set in that context. So the chemical register of waste, of course, is it sort of becomes a dominant way in which waste and toxicity appears in this book. But the other is forms of poison or forms of contamination So I'm using contamination as a rubric here. And which is where I'm also bringing in, going beyond the narrative of environmental precarity, or which then sort of this whole idea of the human as the savior, and the idea of the human as needing to come and intervene and perform these acts of cleanup, which we know are they also have underlying again ideological issues, because this I am very wary of this idea of a plastic free world. Or I mean, I understand the need for it, I understand the need to advocate for removing, and I also understand where plastic as a material is coming from. It's
Yeah.
obviously tied to histories of extraction, fossil fuels, petrochemical industries, and so on. So I do understand that, but at the same time, there is a certain privilege assumption to envisioning this world that is pure. Because we know this from Mukul Sharma has done work on this, Vinay Gidwani has worked on this, that this whole idea, the whole discourse of purity itself, of the sanitized society, it's sort of again embedded in discourses of caste, race, gender, even, and so on. So that predicament is something that I'm trying to address in this, where I'm looking at alternative registers of toxicity. Now, that could come from language. So, a certain kind of contaminated language that Sinha explores, where he's clearly challenging mainstream media journalistic reportage with animals, or Janwar as he calls him, his kind of a deliberate use of a certain scatological discourse or references to the body, hypersexualized, innuendo-laden language. So language that it's in many ways, it kind of performs that toxification on itself. And that I see as inaugurating a new kind of episteme. Of sort of this whole idea that language itself is infected here. And so what kind of, if language is contaminated, what is this contaminated language? What does it look at? What kind of narratives does it allow to come through? So that is one. The other is at the level of language itself, but also at the level of the environment, at the level of the non-humans. So there's a part where I explored the datura flower, and these kinds of naturally occurring, and I don't talk about it in the article, but this distinction between the toxicant and the toxin, and how animal in a moment of acute distress mobilizes the power of this alternative poison to kind of inhabit this alternative world. Now, this is happening, obviously, of course, at the realm of the speculative, at the realm of the fantastic. But for a while, both in the case of Zafar as well as Animal, it kind of allows them that consumption of that toxin ingestion. And ingestion then again is a form of bodily contamination, of welcoming the other. And I also look at this idea in the Shitala essay, that the other essay that I've recently written about South Asian forms of ideas of disease. So this idea of becoming this absolute host, or this idea of absolute hospitality, Derrida's idea of absolute hospitality, where you open your body to the other, can then, can poison or contamination or toxicity become a lens through which we can explore these philosophical concepts. And it allows both these characters to experience something that goes beyond the human, the bodily, the anthropocentric. In the case of Zafar, it even adds up to a new kind of political resistance, because he's poisoned by his friend, and it happens while he's on this austerity, this kind of hunger strike. And if that is one mode of performative resistance or performative politics, ingestion actually becomes another form of political performance. So I'm also sort of looking at how Sinha resignifies the toxin itself, while acknowledging the harm and the injury done by chemicals and the industrial sort of dimensions of it, but also, can we rethink pollution itself? Can we rethink waste? So that's sort of what I'm trying to do in that work.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because, like, I've been trying to, think about animals, people in terms of the parable of the sour, Octavia Butler, where she's talking about hyper empathy in terms of like this imagined sort of idea of 2024. The way these texts sort of redefine the concept of survival and resistance is very unique. I think like Animal's character is not just sort of pushing us into this idea that we have to resist in a traditional sense. But because animals is not trying to like become whole again, he's rejecting this notion of becoming whole again.
Yeah,
What are your
there is
thoughts
a
on that?
rejection of cure, right? Because there is the whole clinic where you have the doctor, you have this the
Yeah.
philanthropist Ellie, right? And she is trying to correct his spine, and he's suffering from scoliosis, and that kind of also has symbolic resonances, and she's trying to cure him and again
Yeah.
turn him into a kind of normative body, and he
And
rejects all of it.
And I think like the other thing is the gas leak is not like a one-time spectacular event. And I think in your conceptualization, you're also saying like it's not slow violence, but toxicity is something that lingers, right? In the bodies, the landscapes, structures of power. So, and how do you view the body in this sort of contextualization of
So,
Sinha's work?
I would couple of things. One is, yes, I'm not denying the validity or the use of the rubric of slow violence at all. Because clearly, there is a persistent quality to toxicity. I've also worked on new radioactive sites. So one of my articles looks at photography of animals and wildlife in radioactive ecology. Even if you look at the nuclear or any kind of chemical waste, it has a very long uh, life. It persists and it transforms and it continues in various ways as sort of embedded in bodies and in the social sphere. So I'm not denying, of course, the slow violence as a mechanism or as a rubric, but what I feel is happening in whether it's waste tide or Wu Mingyi's Man with Compound Eyes, these are the texts that I'm looking at, or even Tejo Shah's Between the Waves, that installation where she has dancers performing on landfills. That there is an attempt to visibilize waste, and that's where the kind of questions begin to emerge. That's from where the questions begin to emerge. That what happens if we treat waste as something that we cannot relegate to the margins? Now, the body in that sense, so this is why I'm saying this is because the body is not a site of inscription. So it's not this passive, brute, inert matter where discourse goes and kind of writes its narratives. But at the same time, it is also a historical. It is the body becomes a site where these histories of exploitation, extraction, inequities are preserved, but they are not preserved as, which is why phenomenology, I find that kind of, again, a useful optic, because these histories then get entangled with the body's own materiality, the body's own functioning, as, for instance, the four-legged human january, right? And sort of, and then what happens to these histories? How do they kind of get articulated? How do they get preserved? Because one thing that Sinha is very clear about, and a lot of contemporary speculative writers who are looking at environmental dystopias are very clear about, is that we cannot wish this away. So how do we tell these stories? How do we narrate these histories without reducing them to either a kind of apocalyptic scenario or by kind of creating this vision of remediation, that this can be managed through technology or through intervention, right? So it's kind of the body that these are histories in limbo, right? These are suspended histories. I like this concept of the suspended state, the suspended narrative or the suspended history.
In terms of,
I would say that if you look at the body, if you make the body as a paradigm here, it would be much more fluid because these stories, these narratives, these histories, these conditions, they're also interacting with and intersecting with the materiality of the body. So I'm also simultaneously interested in the matter. So how, for instance, there is this instance in the book where an animal starts picking the scabs of his own feet and ingesting that. And while it is a comment on the dire circumstances, the conditions of his existence, it is also a kind of, it's also that site where the abject, the wasted, the toxic intersects with the skin, right? So the epidermis itself becomes it's no longer purely human or purely anthropocentric. It is what harbors that waste, and it becomes part of embodied experience, or even the relationship with the dog.
Yeah, that's clear in your work that toxicity is not just a destructive, but it's generating new forms of damage sort of life. How does that resonate with your larger studies of multi-species, solidarities in these sort of exclusion zones or speculative media or literature?
So most of the speculative narratives that I have explored kind of see the damaged ecology or the ruin as a space for fostering multi-species. Because I mean, going back to the concept of survival, right? Survivance or survival. It's the ruin also becomes a space where you realize two things. One is that you're a porous subject. You cannot continue to remain in this kind of citadel of isolation. You also realize your interdependence on other forms of life, not
Yeah.
just for survival, but also for thinking of your own identity as a
Yeah.
subject. And so this whole idea of inhabiting a shared space becomes extremely poignantly so I mean prominent in these spaces. So the kind of the extinction ecology or the ruin or the damaged ecology as a space that fosters, it becomes a space for thinking about multi-species relations, but no longer in that hierarchical mode. So, which is also my problem with conservation narratives or conservation discourse, because I am interested in interspecies narratives that dismantle the whole hierarchy of the human as needing to save. The human equally needs to be saved. We are living in a world where, in fact, the inorganic has become part of the organic. Plastic is part of our bodies, so it's sort of we will have to rethink the hierarchical paradigm itself, and that is something that is enabled by destruction.
Yeah.
So that's the
So
starting point, of course. And then, of course, this whole question of obligation and stewardship. And so, I mean, yeah, we're sort of dismantling the idea of hierarchy, but at the same time, we also need to recognize reciprocity and obligation and ethics, so which is where that sort of opens up another can of worms. So what is the ethical way to be in a multi-species space?
do you draw on Timothy Morton's concept of hyposubject to think through forms of subaltern resistance? Yeah. How is disability in animals, people framed not as a lack, but another way of inhabiting toxicity? And how does the hyposubject sort of disrupt neoliberal sort of narratives of health?
Such a relevant question. So the hyposubject, I mean, Morton's conception is a new way of approaching the subject, which is a historical necessity because we are all diminished subject in the kind of the Anthropocene or Capitalocene or whatever you want to call it. But this kind of an endangered, precarious planetary state, it kind of becomes a historical inevitability that we are all in some senses diminished subjects. So the paradigm of the neoliberal paradigm or the Enlightenment paradigm of the humanist subject as autonomous, bounded, unified, conscious, rational, etc., that is no longer tenable because we are living in crisis formations right now. So we also need to think of the subject as in relation to that crisis. So the subject itself becomes a crisis formation. So the hypersubject then becomes a concept with which to explore subjectivity in a minor register, which then, I mean, again, I must sort of admit that Morton, sort of my interest in Morton this is very early. This was when I was exploring other ways of thinking about subjectivity. This also, we need to remember that Morton is working within a certain Western environmentalist discourse or philosophical discourse. So his application of the hypersubject may not work when it comes to, say, Dalit bodies or Dalit ecologies or even Black fugitivity. So that's something that I'm aware of. But having said that, I've found the hypersubject as a useful tool because for two reasons. One, it obviously gives us a new articulation of subjectivity in Anthropocenic times. And two, because it kind of gives that legitimacy or that space to disavowed subjects, to forms of embodiments or subjectivities that are rejected or abjected or that do not fit within the anthropocentric norm. So disability is one. And disability in particular, because I am interested in disabilities that are again produced by toxification, by wasting.
Mhm.
That's a specific kind of approach to disability that I'm using. So again, it's not again a medical paradigm of disability at all that I'm interested in. In fact, in Sinha, the whole idea of disability is going against the medical model. The pathological body becomes a site of resistance. One is by sort of rejecting this whole narrative of what a healthy or a normal body looks like or what it should look like, and recognizing that health itself is an exclusionary idea that comes at the cost of other certain communities or certain lives and livelihoods. So, and health is not a universal, and the universalization of health itself needs to be questioned. It's part of that problem. So that there is a very clear rejection of that in these narratives where disability is posited as a kind of corollary of environmental damage. It also, in Sinha's work specifically, it is a site of empathy with the non-human, with there is that particular moment where animal discovers that he is clairaudient and he can hear the voices of the unborn. So there is this aborted fetus in a jar that he it's happening inside a laboratory, which is again that kind of Foucauldian space of normalization and docilization. But within that space, it is his scoliosis that is kind of giving him this ability to converse with another non-normative body. And there's a suggestion that an animal can hear this because he shares that kind of that similar embodiment. So there is an attempt to demystify disability, to demedicalize disability, but at the same time also think of it as a form of embodiment, not necessarily as something that's a lack or that is an inhibition, but again as kind of as a capacity. So Derrida's that idea of passivity being a form of capacity, and sort of it makes him receptive to those voices, invisible voices, and so that the whole idea of slow violences or invisibilized registers becomes kind of accessible through the mode of disability. Animals, it also in this book, it also becomes so empathy is one, empathy and interdependence and intertwining with the non-human, with the spectral. And he also has this ability to, when he revisits that factory, he can hear. There's a line in that passage where he sort of says that he can hear the ghosts of the people who died there or the lives that were lost there. So again, it gives him a kind of ability to access that which is unrepresentable. And then it raises questions about the limits of representation itself. So there is that. It also, I mean, the very obvious relation that he has of it's a kind of a filial relation of caregiving with the dog, and sort of his being four-legged. And throughout, and that's also very interesting that animality and disability are collapsed. There are two things that are happening there again. So the collapse is reminding us of the biopolitical paradigm, where one way of excluding the disabled is by equating the disabled or the racialized body with the animal, with bare life.
Yeah.
So Sinha is alerting us to that. So it's a very clever tactic that he's using. But
Yeah.
it's also moving beyond that, sort of saying that this is a kind of, again, multi-species empathy or multi-species connection that the disability is allowing. So that those are just two instances off the top of my head, but there are several. But the book is very wary of, so on the one hand, kind of showing how the pathological body has been used as a kind of either as a cautionary tale or as a kind of as a site of marginalization or exclusion, but also going beyond that and creating gradients of resistance.
Yeah, I want to transition into your article, Radiant Ecologies. You explore how like photography grapples with nuclear violence in Chernobyl and Fukushima. And what drew you to these sites? And does your positionality in South Asia offer a different lens on how these ecologies of harm, and what drew you to sort of looking at these landscapes?
I suppose it does, right? I mean, I have not consciously thought about this because I have not used any South Asian scholarship to interrogate these spaces. So, but I assume that one's positionality does end up informing one's critical lens. So I mean, there are two things that, so one was, I was kind of, because this was written as a paper for a conference on animals in war and disaster. So that was the impetus for this. And again, I wanted to kind of look at non-spectacular forms of disaster, pervasive. So disaster that just doesn't end with that event, but a new way of thinking of the event itself as beyond the non-apocalyptic, as something that permeates and sort of continues in these incremental or the slow forms. And that was one, because I was looking at nuclear waste and how radioactive waste operates. So I'm kind of trying to draw a parallel between radioactivity's own visual style, and it sort of has this kind of it allows us to approach the invisible in a particular manner, and photography as a medium. But I think primarily where my position I think matters is in my resistance or my wariness to see these sites as utopian spaces where the human has been replaced by the non-human, or sites where which have kind of in a way escaped. So again, this attempt to whitewash the damages of radioactivity and say that, well, okay, lives were lost and and there was an enormous cost of these explosions and so the nuclear waste coming into these spaces, but eventually these have become spaces of rewilding. The non-human has taken over, and we can think of these as kind of resorts almost, or the greening of these spaces. Now that is a narrative that I do not buy, and I feel that so much of media and so much of photography, Daman Richter, for instance, have projected Chernobyl, not so much Fukushima, but Chernobyl as these almost fantasy spaces, these utopian spaces of greening. But greening at the cost of what? Because again, that whole narrative of greening, my fears, I'm very afraid, I suppose, of historical erasure and amnesia. The celebration of greening should not come at the cost of forgetting the dangers of nuclear energy, if not monitored or if not critically approached. So that's where I think the whole biopolitics part of it comes. That I'm sort of looking at studies which are now coming up. These are recent studies which see that it's not as if the animals have not escaped mutation, or that there is this entire forest of, I think these were pine trees or redwood. I'm forgetting the actual species, which were destroyed by radiation. Mutation. There are instances of mutation. It's a sort of the lives of there's this essay by Jonathan Turnbull that looks at the dogs of Chernobyl. These are feral animals, and to say that they are living in some kind of a utopian space would be a form of would be reductionist and also erasing certain histories. So I kind of want to approach this whole idea of, or this whole narrative of rewilding, through the lens of harm and injury caused by radiation. So I suppose that is where my position sort of comes in. I don't know if I've answered your question.
No, that was excellent.
And I will think about it now.
This brings me to the concept of visual in nuclear photography, the spectral realm of what cannot be seen. And how does that reshape our ethical responsibilities as witnesses to nuclear harm?
Thank you so much for that question. So with the nuclear, there are two. We're looking at kind of two problem areas. One is the difficulty of comprehending it. And in that sense, it is a hyper object. So the difficulty of comprehending it, the difficulty of registering it as a harm, even as a kind of danger, even. The other is that the nuclear itself has been part of a visual discourse. And I explore a little bit of that at the beginning of the article, that it sort of opened specifically because of its kind of ontological character, its spectral character. It sort of became this space of fascination for thinking about mutation or monsters, so radioactive monsters. It kind of led to a whole speculative genre, where again it was also part of the atomic race, where the whole point was to glorify nuclear energy, even though it is invisible or it's something that we cannot conceptualize. The very sort of unrepresentability of it adds to the nuclear being this kind of utopian intervention, or this technology that sort of answers all our energy problems. Also as an emblem of unchallenged power. So there is also, in that sense, the problem of misrepresentation and the kind of nuclear conscious or nuclear visuality. I look at the idea of nuclear unconscious, but there is also a nuclear conscious or a nuclear, a kind of dominant visuality that gets formed around nuclear power with early films like Godzilla, or even this understanding that nuclear energy itself works like a photographic process. But my interest in the nuclear is primarily sort of taking this idea of the invisible and looking at invisibilized lives. So I am interested in animals because we don't talk about, there's hardly any literature or even journalistic work on the animal survivors of nuclear disasters. We only think about, and we know this now, that in Chernobyl, the dogs were left behind. The people were instructed to leave their dogs behind for the fear of the dogs being vectors of contamination. And then they were culled eventually. And some of them managed to escape, and the present dogs are in fact the descendants of the early, the dogs that managed to escape that culling. So so can we think of nuclear disasters as forms of ecocide? And so my interest is in sort of looking at the invisible also in that register. That, how can we extrapolate the idea of the nuclear as invisible, as sort of allowing us to think about the invisible, and to acknowledge the invisible and politicize it and kind of look at invisible lives or invisibilized lives. And these are lives that are, again, directly affected by the nuclear, by the sort of the fallout, or by the flip side of nuclear energy. And the three photographers that I chose, and two primarily, Mitika and Oldham, I sort of felt that there is an attempt to engage with the invisibility of these lives, the invisibilization of these lives, while recognizing them as irradiated subjects, radioactive subjects. And so, again, also allowed me to go back to biopolitics, go back to this whole idea of the disposable life, the life that we want to kind of wash our hands of, either because they don't matter, or in this case, because they are polluted. And they become emblems of that pollution. And there are various categories of kind of referring to that pollution, either as feral or wild or excessive or mutant. But ultimately, it boils down to Zoe, to bare life that is not to be included in the idea of a qualified life, or a life worth saving and defending. So photography then as kind of providing a kind of visibility, but a very critical visibility, a politicized visibility. Right? So where, it is actually the invisibilization that is being visibilized. So there is this very poignant photograph by Pier Paolo Mitica of this cattle farm this is in Fukushima, where you have these cows that have been left behind. And the photograph is of this emaciated cow looking at the skeleton of her companion that has died. And it's sort of, the shot is a low angle shot. So it's kind of making us see the damage that has happened to the land, the earth itself, while taking us through. So it's guiding the eye from the surface of the earth through the skeletal remains to that emaciated. That's the kind of work that I'm interested in. It's a certain visibilization of invisible, which also reminds us of the kind of ideological operations of invisibilization itself. But invisibilization itself comes from that there is a certain violence that is kind of premeditated violence that causes invisibilization, and how the nuclear then participates.
Bringing in Anna Singh's art of noticing into conversation with your work, do you see, I think this theme resonates through a lot of what you're trying to do, which is this practice of noticing. How might it help to notice forms of life that are otherwise erased or often overlooked by dominant narratives?
It's also, I'm going to rephrase your question a little bit and expand it. It's not, I think what is at stake here, not just recognizing, acknowledging, notice, finding new ways of documenting these lives that fall outside of the biopolitical paradigm, lives that sort of become resource for extraction, or lives that are sort of immaterial in many. But it is also what it does to the view. The kind of questions it raises for the position, the visual subject, the viewing subject. That's where I think, for me, that is the pertinent question, because it reminds us of the limits of representation itself. It reminds us of the historical location, how we see that. Seeing is not this default. Vision is not a default capacity that we have. That it originates from certain discursive and political position. So it allows us to recognize that, and then allows us to. It tells us something about the epistemology of vision itself, that operates from within certain meaning systems or within certain dominant knowledge, and in that they also come with certain limiting.
Yeah.
And what it then does, it does to unravel the structure of the anthropocentric subject, how it kind of shows us, it's sort of in a way that we are entangled, we are responsible, we need to become critical of our choices, presumption, our sort of position in the world. So it kind of, I think for me, that is, I mean, I'm obviously interested in the kind of possibilities arts of noticing open up for lives that are sort of that liminal lives, or lives that occupy that constitutive outside. But what does it do to the constitutive inside? What does it do to the privileged sub? How does it change our definitions of ethics and agency and identity? Because I think that in the kind of world that we are in, that is, I think, what we need to become aware of. That hubris and the greed and the extractivist mind. That is where I think the real intervention needs to happen, to kind of recognize that this hubristic narrative is not tenable. It's not going to. If you're looking at a larger planetary, I mean, it's going. There are degrees to that. The we itself is a problem, but at one level, I also feel that there needs to be, this is Dipesh Chakrabarty's idea, right? That species narrative also needs to be into the picture somewhere. And I think arts of noticing allow us to acknowledge that shared.
Yeah. You did a really cool piece on Sense8. Sense8's kind of unique. It was a major TV show in which the Sense8s experience each other's sensations collapsing, distance, and difference. And it has a portrayal of interconnected bodies under a neoliberal regime. Do you see the series complicating the narrative of resilience or resistance, or does it offer a different kind of multi-species or collective subjectivity?
So I would say the premise, I enjoyed I would say the premise, or at least the aspiration, that it probably started out with. I mean, there is something was taking from that. There is a critical potential, but for me, there are also a lot of problems. So I mean, yeah, I mean, let's talk about the what I find enabling about that. So I mean, for one, it kind of, again, it challenges that whole idea of the bounded sub. And there is this sort of uh, through that speculative idea of the sensorium, the sort of the connected sensorium. It's perception that allows us sort of connect with each other and recognize that this idea that we are not isolated silos. That there is that possibility of resonance, and this is kind of this paradigm of interconnectivity, where literally the body becomes this receptive medium for experiencing the experience of others across a kind of transnational stuff. The transnational is where the problems, and I've looked at this in the essay as well, in the article. While on the one hand, conceptually, what it is doing is that it's sort of giving us tools with which to rethink things, and interconnect, right? And as also a fluid, and in that sense, evolve. Because what it does to then the norms of gender, race, the way it exposes the boundaries, race and gender as kind of construct. There's a kind of deconstructionist kind of possibility there, which I feel that it also does not address its own trap, which is that it attempts to represent the transnational while falling into these stereotypes, the locals. So it doesn't. I remember being very disturbed when I saw the representation of India there, where out of all the things that you could have possibly thought, you had to choose that crowded temple, and you had to choose Ganesh. And again, I felt so there. I mean, I felt that it was again reinforcing certain neoliberal stereotypes of what the global South looks like. That you had to bring in the overcrowded space, and even Kenya for that. I understand that there is an acknowledgement of the water wars and resource scarcity. I mean, the global North is being blamed and held accountable, yes. But the fact that that becomes a kind of paradigm, or that becomes a template for representing these spaces, how, so on the one hand, there's an attempt to ghetto us and stereotype, and then sort of say, oh, but we are all connected. So for me, that idea of connection then becomes it's not foolproof, or it's not entirely thought. So that's one. So I feel like there's a discrepancy between the concept and the execution. The other problem that I have is also with the fact that this was on streaming media, and that's the second part of my chapter. Again, this is part of a proliferation of speculative narratives for streaming. And that the platform itself as contributing to recalibration of attention, as contributing to forms of immaterial, as sort of creating this addicted subject, or this new consumer. And I saw that again reflected in a very uncritical manner in the again the narrative of the series. For me, that is where there are these gaps. In the Vachon's case, this attempt, of course, is commendable, but the philosophy and the politics don't kind of come together. And that's my critique of
it. Absolutely. You also mention the usage of English as a language for the transnational sort of solidarity that emerges through the sensates. Can you speak to that a little bit and what your critique is on that?
Yeah, so again, I feel that in Sensate, there is already a kind of understanding of what transnational solidarity looks like, or what it should look like, where the ability to be connected because of it's a shared ability that they all have because of being a certain kind of homosensorium, being a certain kind of species. They're not humans, they are another kind of species. That is what allows you to read and understand each. Now, that it's sort of, I feel there is a problem of applying that notion of resonance or solidarity or connectivity to, because it kind of ignores real world difference, right? The sort of real racial or political or gendered or economic difference. There is also, and of course, here the medium itself plays a part. The cinematic medium allows for these jump cuts or these transitions where you have a body, so the subject is a Kenyan subject. It's the body of the Korean, girl who's coming and fighting for. So there are these literally the collapse, and the collapse is where my problem is, because again, as I said, that there is the danger of erasure. So I feel that specificity, it's so how is specificity being highlighted? Through these very recognizable tropes of what it means to be Indian, what it means speak a certain kind of Indian English or eat Indian food. So the difference, the specificity, the nuance gets reduced to these very identifiable for the West, identifiable culture. And then the question of connectivity is celebrated as this kind of very sort of convenient and easy and effortless, which is attributed to speculative factors, or this, ontological factors. They have this so where is the solidarity then? There is no idiom of solidarity. It sort of becomes yes, it's sort of living somebody else's life allows you to appreciate. That's the kind of idea of solidarity that I ultimately sort of garner from this.
So I want to return to the question of slow violence as framed by Rob Nixon and how he intersects with your studies of toxic landscapes and speculative worlds. Does the slow temporal scale of toxicity and waste and these landscapes demand new forms of storytelling or critique?
Yeah, I mean, because it's sort of, and I don't know if I'll be able to pronounce the second car. So he's done work on the dynamics of storytelling in kind of in precarious life. I mean, for one, the way the materiality of toxicants, or how pollution in conjunction conditions or social we must be very wary of thinking of toxicity and pollution as isolated. Waste is an entangled phenomenon. Toxicity works in conjunction with pre-existing damage and sort of forms of ruination. And here I'm using Anne Laura Stoller's idea of so toxicity imposes itself or implicates itself into ruins to create forms of. So it sort of automatically challenges the concept. If it's something that has a kind of a peculiar gesture and a kind of life cycle, the life cycle of the chemical or the pollutant, which, I mean, sometimes in the case of radioactive waste goes the individual life. It in that sense, in a temporal sense, so that's the first level. So in a temporal sense, it chronological time, and in that sense, chronological forms of making sense of world. Right? Chronological forms of making. It also it also sort of forces us recognize dissonance and inter part of the meaning making process. That meaning may not always have a logical progression or follow a logical that causality may not be the only way of making sense. When you're looking at these blasted, you also have to take into consideration fragmentation, the violence, say displacement, unfamiliarity. So how and so these kind of again enter into the narratives and conventional sort of the episteme of storytelling as some that needs to follow a progression. This is the whole developmental model of storytelling, where the cause needs to lead to an effect, or that everything needs to have a logical connection. That may not be possible or existing in a world where experience itself is ruptured and constantly our experience of time and space itself. There are unprecedented forms of experience. Uh, the
Yeah.
so that is one way in which sort of it enters into the space of narrative dialogue. It obviously evinces and compels new expression, not just storytelling, but even new ways of expression. How do you call which you have not encountered before? I mean, the whole the Great Pacific Gyre. Now, how do you have to come up with new ways of new vocabs, not just forms of storytelling, but also language itself needs to be reinvented. In fact, there is, I think, work done by Glenn Albrecht, if I'm not mistaken, where he's come up with a glossary for the answer, where he's invented new terms like solastalgia to talk about these new forms of experience, unprecedented experience.
How do you see your work evolving as the Anthropocene and its critiques sort of continue to shift?
So I would like to, I mean, I'm more interested now in kind of shifting from the implications of waste and toxicity, the social for uh, community, as again, I feel there's a certain anthropocentric bias in my, to how it life at a molecular level or even at the level of so forms of life which have not, so forms of life, the impact toxicity has not really been. So that's something that that's one area I see, and forms of life that in non-human form. So the waste and the non-human is like the next area of inquiry. I'm also interested in interrogating the politics or the limitations. So, for instance, eco-cinema or eco-photography or even installation or visual art, and sort of trying to think the problematics of, say, exhibitions where you're still using the white cube or you're sort of still working within an apparatus, display and consumption and dissemination. And sort of how do we upgrade these or how do we rethink this in light of the right? So yeah. I'm interested in medium also, and that's something that I've not done because my work has been primarily in literature and literary with engagements with cinema and visual arts, but I'm moving more now to problematizing the medium itself. And do we think through the materiality of media in the
Finally, for our listeners who may be encountering these ideas for the first time, where would you suggest they begin? Are there any particular books, films, artworks that opened up these questions for you and that you return to from time to time?
Okay, so someone who's encountering these ideas, I will recommend so far sort of understanding toxicity and waste beyond the purely or merely environment. I would recommend Marco Armiero's Waste. A very it's a monograph. One can finish it in one sitting. There is Max Liboron's Pollution is Colonialism. There is also Vinay Gidwani's work on the informal economy. So that's again something that I've not touched upon today, but that's another. Federico de Maria's work on again waste workers. People who actually live and sustain themselves on waste as a form of economy, waste as in terms of cinema, I would Shaunak Sen's recent film, all that, which kind of again looks at multi entanglements in the context of air pollution in Delhi, but also not just talking about the. So it's about these two amateur doctors who are trying to save the kite, the black kite, which is seen as a scavenger, and hence again, it's a kind of life that is relegated to the and how these kites are now endangered because of the pollution and because they keep getting caught in these wires, and so it's also connected with organization. And there's this group of people who are now dedicated to saving the scavenger. So, which is again, which also brings the whole concept of that which is abjected and relic. Sean, there was also a recent Lithuanian film, Vespa, which is again speculative. It sort of looks at this at sort of a post-apocalyptic Earth. There is Varun Thomas Matthews' Black Dwarfs of the Good Little Bay, which I hugely recommend because it's one of those very few speculative, eco-speculative texts coming out of India that is offering a scathing review, but also critique of so many issues that go hand in hand with environmental including right-wing politics, fascism, fake news, and so many things happening there. So that's other, and also this question of art as forms of resistance. So to begin with, I mean, these are the book cinema that I could. I'm sure there are so many.
No, this has been an amazing interview. Thank you for joining me on the Organic Filaments Network, where we trace the fugitive threads of power, resistance, and planetary life. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to keep these conversations flowing. Again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Cher. It's been very stimulating, and I'm tempted to go back and read all of my research in the light of the questions that you've asked. Thank you for engaging work so methodically and with so much attention. And yeah, thank you for sort of demonstrating the importance of the arts of noticing. When it comes to our own work. So thank you. It's been a
I learned so much. Thank you.
Thank you.